together food and energy are over 20% of your spending. Lower income households probably going to spend more on that than obviously middle or upper income households. So that's a problem for people. And if politicians and the administration can't get affordability down, then they're going to vote those people out of office.
I recently had a chance to speak with Joe Lavorgna. Joe is a head economist for SMBC Bank right now, and I found the discussion with him really interesting for a handful of reasons. One, Joe always has a unique take on the current economic situation and what's driving the economy and what people are not talking about that they should be talking about. But two, he recently finished serving in the Department of Treasury. So his insight of how economic policy is actually made in DC and the different tensions on economic policy, I found really fascinating. Additionally, I think Joe has an interesting perspective that's helpful for everyone to look at. His passion and the reason he would take off time as a professional to volunteer his time to work in the Department of Treasury is his view that the economy is not working correctly right now for the middle and working class and what to do about it. It's an interesting take on the topic, and I hope that you enjoy watching the interview and learning from Joe as much as I enjoyed speaking with him. Joe, it's good to see you again.
Good to see you, Matt.
Thanks for being here.
Thank you.
Can you go through and just remind me, I know that you just came out of the Trump administration. I know it was your second tour of duty. Can you remind me of what your first tour of duty was and why you went back for a second tour?
PTSD.
Yeah.
My first tour, I was chief economist of the National Economic Council, and I worked for Larry Kudlow, who was a director of the NEC, as it's known, and was also special assistant to President Trump.
And in the second tour, what did you go back and do?
I went back the second tour as senior counselor to Secretary Bessent, effectively like in a chief economist macro advisory role. So it was somewhat similar in terms of what I did in the first administration. In the second administration, although instead of working for the NEC, I was working what I think is the most important agency in government, or at least up there with Secretary of State, and that is Treasury. So I worked directly for the Treasury Secretary.
So you're living a happy life. You're successful in business. What makes you want to go back and work in politics?
Well, a couple of things. One is you really sort of feel, Matt, like it's an obligation. I remember when I went in the first time, Larry invited me down to have lunch in the West Wing, and it's a pretty cool experience. And he said, "You want to come work for me?" And I'm like, well, I want to say, "Oh yeah, of course." But my initial instinct was, let me just check with my wife, because you have to live in DC. You live in New York, and living in DC is obviously a different state. It's not very close. And then the same kind of thing happened. So I had to say yes. And then, of course, when the secretary said, "Would you like to come work with me?" You sort of like, it's almost like in the movie Liar, Liar with Jim Carrey. Like, you don't want to leave your family. You don't want to leave the job that you really enjoy. But it's like, yes. And it's like, I didn't mean to say it, but you can't. It's like you just sort of feel like you need to do it because of the honor. You serve the country. And the government, whatever one's politics, needs good people. And if you think you can make a difference and just improve things even a little bit and give good advice, good counsel, it's incumbent upon you to do it. And therefore I did it, and it was a great experience.
And when you think about America and our economic power, if we look forward 10 or 20 years, what are our biggest opportunities and what are our biggest risks thinking about us just as a country?
Well, clearly, people have been worrying about the debt for a long time, and it almost feels a little bit like the boy who cried wolf, because as the debt to GDP has continued to go up, we're now over 100% of GDP, still haven't really had a big effect. But at some point that is going to limit our ability, because as we look forward to the future, having national security, economic security, having what is probably a necessary cohesive industrial policy because of China, which I know we'll get into, we need to protect the US workforce, and some of that's going to require money. And if we're running consistently 5-6% deficit to GDP ratios, we're going to be limited in what we can do to help that economy really evolve more noticeably in the 21st century. So that's a concern of mine. And the other, of course, is what happens from a regulatory side with AI, which has a tremendous potential to be extraordinarily disruptive to people's lives. What happens to unemployment? What happens to workers who had high-paying jobs that lose those jobs? What happens to society? I mean, we're already very divided, so you can imagine, oh my gosh, if some of these terrible doomsday forecasts of AI are even half true, what does that mean for us? So the government's going to have to play an active role in some ways, helping out, and we need the money to help do it. So we do need to probably get ourselves on better fiscal footing.
Now, theoretically, the Fed should be insulated from politics, and the Treasury is part of the fiscal side of politics that comes in office every 4 years with the president. Give me a little bit of inside baseball on how the Fed and the Treasury work with each other.
So the Treasury has a huge regulatory arm as well. They manage they're senior to OCC, Office of Comptroller of the Currency. So they've got a huge regulatory role, which the Fed does, and there's weekly meetings between the Treasury Secretary and the Federal Reserve. It's been going on for a long period of time. The Fed is the fourth branch of government, so it is independent in some sense, but it's still accountable to Congress. The president generally wanting to have an opinion on monetary policy, I think is actually a good thing. I don't think the Fed should be above reproach. I don't think that just because in the past presidents and people in elected office, couldn't talk about the Fed because it was somehow taboo. I don't necessarily think that's right. And the Fed itself, Jay Powell, the chair, has even highlighted the fact that they made some mistakes. And nominee Warsh is going to try to come in and make some changes as well. Maybe have a wholesale reevaluation of the forecast process. The Fed thought inflation was transitory. It wasn't. They caused huge inflation spike, in addition to excessive government spending under the prior administration. So, the Fed shouldn't be above criticism, but you have to do it, I think, in a more productive way, perhaps, than what's happening at the moment. So they're insulated, but not fully. Nor do I think they should fully be, insulated, because I do think there needs to be some accountability, but it depends how you do it.
So in your job in the Treasury, you have to look at what's happening in the U.S. and the U.S. economy. You're also watching the international economy constantly. And the international economy tends to make a lot of news right now. My first question for you on that is, when we look at China, one of the pro-China arguments is China has a big advantage that they can take a long-term view of their economy. They don't have presidential elections every 4 years. They don't have Congress turning over every 2 years. As you think about China right now and its strengths and its weaknesses, how should the U.S. think about them? Are they friend? Are they competitor? Are they foe? Are they different kind of characteristics for different areas?
A little bit of everything, Matt. I think D.C. generally, within policy circles that I was around, we generally have thought of China as being both a peer competitor and strategic adversary. We're kind of in a bipolar system now, with the U.S. and China being the two main superpowers. So it's sort of a natural evolution. But so they can be foe and they can be friend, to answer your question. Certainly, the world is different now than it was prior to China entering into the world trading markets. I remember Bill Clinton talking about an industrial policy back in the late 80s, early 90s, and others. Remember Lester Throw ran the business school at MIT, talking about the need to protect industry. Fast forward 30, 40 years later, and it's clear that there's issues that China poses to the U.S. in terms of competing. We saw it with supply chains during COVID, and the administration is aware of it. What's interesting, Matt, is that that's one of the few areas, perhaps, of bipartisanship that, remember, when the Biden administration came in 21, they kept all the Trump tariffs. And they also put restraints on the technology, sensitive technology we could export to China. So whatever next administration or party runs things in 29 and beyond will probably keep those tariffs in place. But the U.S. has to figure out a way to protect itself, national security, economic security, perhaps bring supply chains closer to home. And the administration currently is working on that, and whoever replaces them, I guess, will. So China will continue to be a friend and foe for the foreseeable future.
So you probably have a very unique perspective on the way that you read news, being in the seat you were in. And you probably can see a news story differently than folks who've not worked in the administration. When you pick up news stories, what are some of the things that you look at in the news story, both to tell the veracity of the story, but what do you see through? Like, what in your X-ray vision, what does it look like?
What I learned is that news stories, wherever they source, we'll talk like more the traditional media, not the sort of the alternative media, so the mainstream media. Stories that are written get shaped. And what I mean by that is oftentimes people will know in government if a story's coming out and have an ability to respond and try to influence that story. And some outlets certainly have a certain bent. They have a certain spin they want to put on. So you're trying to get your viewpoint in that story. But what you realize is it's really a business. Certain outlets are going to be more favorable on certain issues than other outlets. And there's certain things that, even when you see TV interviews, certain things will mention this isn't going to be talked about, or this could be talked about. There's more interconnectivity in the stories from those that are quoted on the record and the reporter than what you think. They're not just written kind of like on their own. There's a lot that goes into these stories, and depending on what reporter's writing it, who they quote, like there's just a lot of things you sort of, when you're kind of in DC, you learn. Okay, this is what they're trying to get at. This is what they're trying to prove. And then you also know, where the quotes are in the story. Are they bearing the lead?
Yeah.
There's I don't want to single people out, but I could show you I kind of know where that story is going to go based on that reporter. Mm-hmm. And sometimes you might get a more favorable story to your cause, where it's not as bad. At least you get your point across, because a good reporter, whatever their bias, is going to say, okay, well, this is what is happening, but this is sort of the counter narrative or the counter view to what is being said, and hopefully you get that out in a way that makes people think, okay, well, it's more nuanced. That's what you're trying to work on in these stories. And the other thing is you have to respond to the press, because if you don't, then they're going to write the story they want without any input from you.
Right. So as a non-political reader of the press, I should probably always be asking myself, who's behind the story and what's the agenda of the story?
Yeah, I remember a long time ago, everybody has an axe to grind, and try to figure out what their predisposition and what their bias is beforehand. That's really, really key. And there's certain people who are better on certain stories than others. Somebody that's, you sort of know from certain reporters are going to cover the economy a certain way versus others. And a lot of times, the other thing that will happen in government, broadly speaking, is people will also plant stories. Mm-hmm. We need to get this message out, and it's an important message, and who can we talk to that'll get that story out? Because it's a business. The irony is that even the hostile press, sometimes they want access. Everybody wants access. They want quotes. They want to show they've got connectivity. So there's a little bit of a give and take sometimes. And if reporters aren't fair, then they're not going to get less access than those that are perceived to be more even-handed.
So it's interesting from our business at Chatham, where we're focused heavily on interest rate markets and foreign currency markets. We're always uncertain about the market's going to go, our rate's going to go up, our rate's going to go down. Should we hedge? Should we not hedge? And part of what we're always trying to figure out is the signal versus the noise in stories, because everyone seems to have an opinion on rates. Right. But if you read most of the stories and you start putting it through, you realize that very few people actually are giving you information that's helpful. They tend to be arguing something other than interest rates. And even when you're reading news, what sources do you look at to get the right, real story, the story behind the story? Yes,
I think right now, with all the computerized trading, the algorithm, the market really, I think, has moved away from sort of any fundamental type of interpretation, at least in the short term, and it just trades headlines. And there is a lot of noise. So effectively, you wind up creating a lot of noise. There's much less signal. It's interesting, as an aside, when you're on the inside, it's interesting what the market's perceptions are in terms of what people know and their ability to influence things from the outside. But where I go for sources, you really have to, I think, you have to sort of read the mainstream press, because that's where the institutional narrative gets formed. And it's got its own bias. So you'd be looking at the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, maybe the Washington Post. There's other outlets. I don't read the LA Times that often because it's hard to get. Maybe Miami Herald, just sort of Chicago Tribune. Those big papers across the country. But I'd say probably mostly Wall Street Journal, New York Times, and then sort of finding alternative outlets. And one of the ways you could do it is, you go on X and there's people, and what I always try to find is who are the people that are interesting, that are insightful, and they're giving predictions. And I'll say, okay, what are they saying? Does that make sense to me? And then from there, are they accurate? How accurate are they? What filter are they using what systematic approach are they using to describe things? And there's so many good things on Substack. And you just sort of reading, you follow interesting people. I don't follow that many people, but the ones I follow, I think, pretty good insight. And you kind of just have to kind of do it on your own. You build your list, and you have to follow who's been right. You want to be right for the right reasons. A lot of people could be right for the wrong reasons.
That's right.
So it's that element. But I get that question a lot. What do you read? What do you follow? And sort of like you sort of follow everything. Who's interesting? And it's not easy because again, as you said, you have signal and noise. Everybody's an expert now on everything, and anybody that's got a camera or a computer or iPhone or any phone can just broadcast what they think. And there's some really good stuff out there. But yeah, it's a challenge to find out who really to follow. What you learn, Matt, is that that narratives get set, and if you're reading the traditional news, you're going to get one side that's not going to give a very small picture of how the world operates. Right. But then the problem is, and this is why it's hard, is that if you go the other track, you also could go down the rabbit hole and the conspiracy theories and things like that. And it's hard to balance the two. What I tend to follow is, I guess to answer your question more simply, is that you can go online and you can look for different professors, academicians, both sides of the political aisle, whether it's political science or economics, and you just try to get, compare and contrast and try to figure it out on your own, like, okay, what makes the most sense? That's probably the best way to do it. Somebody that's somewhat credentialized, but I try to find the non-consensus people within that sphere.
Yeah, I've always found there's a handful of principles I try to follow. One is if somebody had really valuable news or a really valuable insight, they probably would be trading on it themselves and not sharing it. Right. So really valuable insights, no one's just going to publish those for free. Two, I have found in the modern news cycle that it is very helpful for me to follow the extremes of both political sides.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
it sounds crazy, and I don't subscribe to either one of them, but most real news stories start on one of those extremes, and they get filtered out. I would say 9 out of 10 stories, or maybe it's 99 out of 100, get filtered out before they hit mainstream.
Right.
But you'll get a jump on the real stories if you follow the extremes, because they tend to pick up on those stories first. Tell me something that, an area where you changed your mind from before you went into the Trump administration the first time to where you sit today from an economics point of view. What's something you used to think is true that you don't think is true anymore?
Well, what I realized is that, you're talking economics, and, it's not a field where it's not like physics where there's more agreement than in a social science. Sometimes it's really, you're making a case, and you sometimes think that, if you make the best argument will win. And what you realize is that there's certain vested interests in the status quo. Mm-hmm. And you're not using facts or figures to persuade people. If they have a certain self-interest, it's going to be hard for them to change their minds. And if you do, it has to be on a more emotional or human level, personal level. So I guess that's it. It's not the best argument that wins. And in D.C., everybody's got these different competing interests, which is oftentimes why it's so hard to get anything done. Mm-hmm. Because the people oftentimes that, there may be a small faction of voting, but somebody's going to argue the most vociferously to not have a certain policy put in place. So I guess what I've learned is it's a lot harder to get things done than you might think, and making the best argument isn't enough. It's more than that. You really have to do it. You have to learn how to persuade on a more emotional level. People respond. I think Jonathan Haidt is a psychologist. I think he said something to the effect that people rationalize what they say after they've said it.
Right.
I'm not saying as eloquently as he did, but it's just one of those things where, it doesn't work. Economics is good, and so it's a logical thought process of like, if this happens, this happens, this happens. So you sort of there's a set of actions if you take one course. So it makes you kind of think things through. But generally, people don't think that way. They'll have a view and then they'll rationalize it afterward.
So he uses a great analogy of somebody who's riding a horse, and that most people think that the rider is in control of the horse. He's like, but if you could actually look in the mirror, it's generally most people are riding an elephant. And if you're riding an elephant, the elephant being your emotions, that you try to justify afterwards where the elephant went, but you don't have as much control over the elephant as you would like to believe, that emotions do drive things. Which will be interesting to watch here, because you and I had a discussion previously about one of the great things about AI is it should allow economists to do a lot more research much faster than they've ever been able to do before, right? So we should be able to get to better facts and figures faster. And on one level, you say that's great. The flip side of AI is it's likely to be what Fox News and MSNBC is, but on steroids.
Yeah.
Right? If you want to start with the end in sight and you say, hey, I want to raise taxes or I want to cut taxes, you can now ask AI, give me 100 different arguments and pieces of data to get to my end goal, which is, I think, exactly what you're saying is we already suffer from this problem.
Right.
And if we throw AI and don't change the way we think about it, we may even be worse than we were.
Yeah, I mean, the thing about AI, which is fascinating, though, is to ask AI a solution to a potential problem, you still need people to do the work, because AI is pulling from information. So people still have to do some work that AI then can pull these studies, because science is always changing. The other issue, too, is that you also have to know enough about your subject matter to realize that AI can give you these scenarios. They may not all be good. Some may actually not even be correct. You have to fact check. You just can't assume it's automatically accurate, which is why I think people say that if you have a certain skill set, AI can make you kind of superhuman. But then what happens to the people who don't have that knowledge base yet? Mm-hmm. They can't apply it or use it in a more effective way, and that becomes a real wedge in terms of the wage issue. And we definitely seem to have a bit of a winner-take-all society where people who are really, really good at their field make extraordinary amounts of money. I always think of sports. Mm-hmm. And people who aren't, they're kind of at the bottom, and AI is driving that wedge. So yeah, it's a very interesting dynamic, which comes back to our earlier question of what does the government do to help out or facilitate things in a way that we lift productivity and everybody's wage rate goes up to some extent.
Yeah. Are you, this is an unfair question, but are you more pro-AI or more afraid of AI at the moment as it hits our economy?
I don't like this word, but we need guardrails. Mm-hmm. So it's coming. It's like you can't, we might as well figure out how to use it in the most productive way and in the safest way. Kind of like with social media. We realize that social media for young adults, children, is not necessarily great for their development. Yeah. Realizing that after the fact. In fact, the Walter we just talked about a few minutes ago has written a book about that and how dangerous it can be for kids. So it's coming, but you want to be able to have it occur in a way that doesn't cause the potential social and emotional disruption it can cause if I don't want to say the doom and gloomers, but the people who are saying this is going to be so transformative that we going to have 20% unemployment. Well, you can't have that. Society won't hold together, won't work. So yeah, I'm worried about it, but it's coming. So you better figure out how to deal with it. And I would rather over prepare than as a society or as a government than under prepare. You know what I mean? If it turns out not to be as big a deal, okay, great. Well, it's sort of like you want it. It's like having a rainy day fund or preparing. God forbid there's an emergency, you want to have some insurance. So if we can do something to mitigate some of the potential disruptive effects on AI, great. Now, what those are, I'm not exactly sure. We could debate that, but. Mm-hmm. I think it's enough of a cause to people. Because you see it I think one of the reasons why consumer confidence, households are petrified of that, because they're seeing what it can do. And you're looking at unemployment rates of young adults is rising, participation rates are falling. Mm-hmm. So there's real concern, they're going to be productive members of the workforce, which we'd like them to be.
Now, the flip side to that is everybody I know who uses it works more now, not less. It seems to drive...
Those that have a job.
Yes, and that'll be the question. Those that have a job, and if we end up in a position where there is people transition to new jobs we haven't discovered yet, or if they transition out of jobs.
I'm an optimist, Matt, so we could fast forward 10 years from now, let's say, and that's a full economic cycle, maybe, and then some. The average business cycle is about 7 years. I think we'll be fine, and I'm an optimist. I think we'll be fine. The U.S. is a dynamic, incredible country, despite the political division. I think we've, there's American ingenuity and dynamism, creativity. You see it in the companies, the hyperscalers. Right. We have a tremendous ability in this country. I'm always an optimist, never bet against America. But it doesn't mean from year 1 to year 10 or 11, there's not going to be major disruption and friction. And I think that's the thing that worries me. We'll ultimately create more jobs, but how do we get there? And we don't want to have a generation of men and women, young boys and girls that don't have good jobs, that aren't gainfully employed. I think that's the key thing. You want people to have meaningful work.
So we're talking today in New York City. Obviously, Mandami is a mayor of New York City, and I think he's a democratic socialist. As an economist, we're seeing socialism or democratic socialism kind of gain in popularity. Can you help us both understand what's happening and why it's gaining in popularity and what some of the implications could be of this?
What's happening is if the economy isn't delivering in a way to help out the less fortunate, think lower middle income classes through, let's say, right-wing populism, which is generally characteristic of the Trump administration's policies the last couple terms, the populace will swing to left-wing populism. And that involves, socialism, where the market forces aren't really as much at play as they would be under a more right-wing or, say, conservative-leaning approach. If you look at the Trump base, for example, where he got a lot of votes, where carrying him over to win in 2024 was working-class whites, blacks, and Hispanics. That voting bloc was very instrumental. The working class, generally speaking, has been very instrumental in getting him into office. If his policies don't work in raising living standards, and I'm using this nationally, but you could bring it down to the mayoral or local level, then people are going to then swing the other way. And people who can't afford a home, that's why affordability is such a big issue now. Someone that's coming in and saying, look, I can fix it, I can promise you this, whatever it might be, they're going to maybe perhaps latch on to that. Even though economically it may be very bad decision making. The heavy hand of government isn't going to work well as the market-based incentive structure. Now, you could argue the efficiency or the outcome of the market maybe isn't what people want, and you could tweak it that way, but you really kind of want the market mechanism to work as best as it can because it's better at allocating resources. And if the government doesn't like the outcome or wants to help out people who, for whatever reason, aren't benefiting from the system, great. But unfortunately, if we go too far to the socialist side, it's my opinion that we'll just have policies that will be very destructive and not effective at all. Mm-hmm. That's the old adage of, you can't give away free things. There's a cost at everything. So nothing is ever free. Economics teaches us there's no free lunch. So I get worried if the policies don't work or you can't convince people, look, this is the right way to go forward for long-term success and prosperity, then people will go the other direction, and you've seen that in other countries. I think in the U.S., that I don't think we'll get that approach. I don't hope. And New York City has had different mayors over the time that have been pro-market and anti-market, and I think New York will ultimately thrive and survive. But if we can do things to mitigate some of the pain or disruption from policies I don't think will be effective, then great. Look, affordability is a real big issue. Matt, it's a real big issue for people. And right now, interest rates are rising, they're not falling. Mm-hmm. Gasoline prices are rising, they're not falling. What's happened in the energy markets is impacting other products, such as fertilizer, which potentially could lead to higher food costs later this year. Food has almost twice the weight in one's consumption basket than energy. Together, food and energy are over 20% of your spending. Mm-hmm. Lower income households probably going to spend more on that than obviously middle or upper income households. So that's a problem for people. And if politicians and the administration can't get affordability down, then they're going to vote those people out of office. And the people coming in, might have policies that may exacerbate the current problem, lead to more scarcity, but people, again, not being happy with their economic plight, perhaps understandably, are going to try something different, even if it, an economist can say, look, that doesn't make sense. It's not what we should do. But as I said earlier, people don't always respond to facts and what may be the best argument. They're going to respond to emotion or their own personal experience and may say, look, this person can't deliver for me. I'm going to try this other person.
When we talk about affordability right now, we're certainly under pressure in affordability as we talk, as we sit right now. The Iran conflict is going on, and the Iran conflict, we're at the moment where we're taping this, where one day we have a ceasefire, the next day the ceasefire has been ripped up, and then the following day it's another ceasefire. So trying to guess exactly what's going to happen in the next day, week, month is almost impossible. How much influence do you think the Treasury has on world affairs like that? When you're the president, how much are you listening to your Secretary of Treasury about whether or not to go to war or not go to war?
On the economic side, Secretary Bessent is clearly the most important economic actor in the administration. At least that's my view, and the president relies on him, and the secretary gives him great advice as sort of a legendary financier. Mm-hmm. I mean, his history and his background speaks for itself. And certainly Treasury is involved in like sanctions. I mean, there's a whole area of Treasury that does terrorism and financial intelligence. So Treasury is very integrally involved as it relates to various sanctioned countries, of course, Iran being one. And the president certainly solicits the secretary's advice. In matters of war and things of that sort, hard to say. I mean, I'd say hard to say. I mean, certainly Secretary of State, Joint Chief of Staff, the intelligence community, it's probably a broader set. But certainly on the economic side, the secretary is the dominant force. And of course, the president takes that advice and hopefully he listens. But, the president sometimes does what the president wants.
Well, there's always been a historic argument that it's actually your ability to finance yourself that wins wars as much as your military might. Now, arguably, military technology and finance are what wins wars. I think there's a famous argument from Yuval Harari, effectively, that the reason that the Dutch take over the whole world is that they figured out a banking system, and so in the Dutch-Spanish wars, it was the Dutch ability to borrow money that let them beat Spain, which is interesting if those are lessons from history that probably, as we are thinking about geopolitics and especially geopolitics in conflict, that
and the nature of conflict itself is changing, as we've seen with the Russia-Ukraine war, drone warfare, and in some sense lower technology. Well, I shouldn't say low technology because I think drones still there's certainly a technological element to it, but
lower cost though.
Lower cost is what I should say, not lower technology. Lower cost is changing things. Look, on the U.S. side, what I want to just say in terms of financing, which is just that people should know, is that the Treasury, as the career people, are very bright, very smart, and there are people who have been there that I got to know a bit who worked in both Democrat and Republican institutions, or Republican and Democrat presidents, and they set the financing, do a very good job, advocating what is the best way to do the financing, and the secretary certainly relies on that analysis. So, I mean, as much as sometimes people may poo-poo or bash the government, there are some really good people or dedicated civil servants.
Yeah. Okay, let's shift to another kind of topic du jour right now, because I think we can kind of take building blocks from everything we've talked about and apply them to private credit and the news in the private credit market. Everything you read about the private credit market seems to be almost sensational at the moment.
Yeah.
What are your opinions?
Fear sells. And fear is the best motivator, and fear sells. And I get why people are highlighting private credit, because there are some similarities to where we were in the financial crisis. Certainly, the opacity, the lack of transparency, the marking to model of assets that are often determined by the people who it's their incentive to have the highest valuations possible. I get that, broadly speaking, but it's much different because number one, the assets are gated, meaning it's hard to get money out, which is good. That wasn't the case with subprime. Number two, it's not the leverage. You don't have financial.
Let me interrupt you for a second, because what you just said, subprime, and that's one of the things that I see people are doing all the time. They're trying to equate subprime
and that was just,
to private credit.
Right, and I just sort of naturally, instinctively mentioned subprime because they're always talking about subprime in the context of the '08 crisis. But you don't have the leverage in private credit. Firms during the crisis, I think Lehman, I looked, was like something like 30, 35, cash to assets.
Right.
So they were completely undercapitalized. And they're borrowing overnight to fund long-term investment. It's not borrow short, lend long is never a good recipe for ultimately a sustainable non-crisis type of business. But what you have in the private credit markets is, you don't run the risk, you don't have the leverage, you don't have, which is important, you don't have the ability to take a run on the bank, so to speak. You've got wealthy individuals, these aren't retail investors. And in many cases, even if you look back at subprime, ironically, a lot of those assets were money good. It's just you were in the middle of a crisis and there was forced selling. There really isn't forced selling with private credit. So therefore, if you could carry your way out, so to speak, a lot of those assets are going to mature at par. And then the last thing is subprime is also tied to housing. That was the big asset on consumer balance sheets. It's not tied to housing, so it's not going to have the same negative wealth effects that it had. So you had excess leverage, a need to raise capital, a bank run, forced selling, and you had assets that for households or their single most important asset on their portfolio falling in price, of course you're going to have a really bad crisis. So in that regard, this is totally different. Now, if the economy goes into a recession, yes, private credit will be less private credit availability, and the problems probably would get worse, and would exacerbate a downturn. But I think people looking at private credit as the catalyst for a recession, I think, are wrong. Subprime was a catalyst and accelerant to the crisis back in 08, 09. This time it's different, and the press picking up on it. It's the old adage, and the generals are always fighting the last war, kind of thing. So, humans are generally pattern recognition people, where they say, "Oh, I see some similarities. It's going to be the same." Well, there are some similarities, but I think there are probably more differences. And in most cases, these assets are going to be money good. Of all the things to fear right now, I don't want to totally minimize private credit, but I just don't think that's one of the top concerns. I think it's sort of, if there's top 5, maybe it's number 6.
Okay. So let's go through, then what are the other top 5?
You're going to ask me that. Well, certainly,
up.
look, interest rates, I think, are too high, and interest rates need to come down. You're seeing manufacturing and housing still weak. Manufacturing recovering, but that may stop because interest
You're
rates.
talking long-term interest rates.
Long-term interest rates.
Right. But how are we going to get long-term interest rates down?
Well, this leads to the second thing. We have an inflation problem.
Right.
We have an inflation problem because what's happening in the Middle East. So you need rates down. That's one concern. If rates stay high, you might lose the cyclical parts of the economy. I mean, we talk about AI. You want the cyclical parts of the economy to really boom. And the tax policy is designed to get that part of the economy to boom. There's full expensing on a structure. Matt, if you build a new building anywhere in the country, you could fully expense it in year 1. Normally takes 39 and a half years to do it. And it's temporary. It's going to expire after 2028. So, but you need lower costs. Lower borrowing costs will help. Lower borrowing costs will help with the housing sector. So if rates stay high, those cyclical parts of the economy are going to weaken. If the cyclical parts of the economy aren't booming, well, then what if you do get AI job loss at some point? That's because AI could come for these white-collar jobs. Well, you want more blue-collar jobs. You want more high-paying construction jobs, manufacturing jobs. You build the factories, you hire people, and you put people in those factories. Those are good jobs. So you've got an interest rate problem, which is a function of an inflation problem.
But let's go back to this. So you said the inflation problem, what's happening in Iran is really hurting the inflation problem.
Well, yeah, look at energy costs. Energy costs have gone up. There's no disputing that. Now, the question is, do prices go back down when this is over? We'll see. But, right now we've got high energy costs. And energy costs, what you have happening is energy costs are going up, while at the moment nominal wage growth is slowing. I do think there's a case you can make it will turn higher, but at the moment, nominal wage growth is slowing. Average hourly earnings, employment cost index, pick your series, the numbers are slowing. Growing at 4, now it's going to be growing at 3.5, 3. And you got inflation picking up. So you're getting squeezed on real wages or squeezing.
Right.
Which is why people right now aren't particularly happy. So you've got interest rates, 1 or 2, what's called, the list doesn't need to be 1, whatever, on them by 5. You have interest rates, you've got inflation, which is tied in part to geopolitics, and geopolitics is creating uncertainty. And at the margin, where economics lives at the margin, companies are uncertain about the future. They may just hold back and not do much. And we're in this low fire environment. And in a low fire environment, anything that causes layoffs can quickly multiply and the economy can weaken. So you've got the geopolitics, number 3. Number 4 is AI. I mean, because, we don't have a lot of hiring right now. Ex-healthcare, job growth is negative.
Right.
So, you've got that aspect of it. And then maybe I would put private credit at 5. I said, I just sort of said 5, but I mentioned 6. I'd have to think about number 5. But the point is, it's not the dominant driver. But anyway, that's sort of the world we're in. We're in a world where we've got the right policies to lead us to very strong growth. And I'm an optimist. I still think at some point we could have a disinflationary boom. But there's other things we need to fix, and I don't know if we're going to be able to fix them in time.
So I think that what's interesting, let's go through that list here. I think private credit I agree with you, it should be top 5. But it's really because if private credit disappears, it's going to take the marginal borrower. It's going to make it that much harder for someone to borrow.
That's exactly right, Matt.
It's not that it's going to take the whole economy down. It's going to take that
and
last
ability.
It's
going to amplify the downturn. That's exactly right.
And it's going to make borrowing more expensive for the normal credit because it's just a supply demand. Ironically, if we go to number 4 in AI might be, there's arguments AI is anti-inflationary.
It is longer term.
Yeah.
In short term, it is. I think it's very anti-inflationary, which is why you could get a disinflationary boom. But you want the cyclical parts of the economy to really going full throttle. Harder to automate those jobs. I mean, maybe at some point you'll have robots doing people's work, but I think that's still a bit science fiction-like.
Yeah, we're not there yet, and I'm with you on high rates. I actually think part of what happened was we got rates on any historic basis aren't actually that high right now compared to how the economies have acted over long periods of time. They just happen to be very high from what they were from 2010 to 2020, and we almost institutionalized these low rates. I believe, like the headline is, you do see some job losses from AI. I actually think you see way more job losses from high interest rates right now.
Well, that's it. That's right.
Than from AI. I think it's the high interest rates that are making it.
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
I think it's exactly right. That's why you want the rates down, because you could see at some point soon, some more, AI-related job loss.
Right.
The other thing too is the government can do is try to figure out ways to get more housing supply on the market. So look at zoning and permitting laws. There's different things we could do. It's going to take a while to try to get more supply on the market, because affordability is a function of three things. It's rates. You can get rates down. It's prices, which have gone up, so you need more supply. And then income. You need more income. If households have more income and they can borrow more cheaply, and the government come up with some ways to increase available supply, then affordability will improve. Right now, affordability is close to its all-time record lows, especially for first-time home buyers. And that's one of the reasons why you see so much angst, understandably so, in the system.
Right. It's, and interest rates restrict supply, turns out. And back to your number one point of interest rates being the biggest risk to the economy right now. If we were here 3 months from now, and interest rates jumped up 30 to 40%, what would be the reason?
Inflation risk premium, inability to replace the IEEPA tariffs. So you have an inflation premium, a revenue issue, maybe some concerns about growth, which is also weakening revenues, but growth isn't weak enough to get the Fed to ease and the market worry about a rate hike. It's basically somewhat similar to the UK, that kind of scenario.
Right.
And it's a risk. I'm not saying it's going to happen, but that would be one of the things I'd be a bit worried about, especially going into the midterms.
And let's go the opposite way. If rates were to lower and go down, what would be the story?
I was pretty upbeat 3 months ago on the outlook. I just think things changed given what's happened in the Middle East. And we haven't fully felt the effects of the energy move. Because I looked at oil, oil this morning before we started our conversation was around $90 a barrel. And I would argue it was going into the 50s a couple of months ago, 3 months ago. So 90 isn't the right price. Eventually it may go lower. It probably will go lower, but in the short term there's some demand destruction associated with that hasn't yet fully impacted the consumer, especially the low-end consumer, which is unfortunately suffering, and arguably is going to suffer more if these prices go up because it's like a big tax hike. Now what's offset it are the tax refunds in the tax bill that was passed last year. But I'd rather have that tax money go to people who want to buy discretionary items and not life's necessities. And if you're using their tax cut to pay for groceries and to fill up your automobile, it's not what I like. I want to see people be able to do some things that they desperately need, because as you know, most people live paycheck to paycheck. So if you could help out the less fortunate, man, that's a great thing.
When your clients are asking you right now about just about your views on rates, we talked about rates going up, we talked about rates going down, but what do you personally think is going to happen?
We're stuck in a range now, Matt, and this is one of those times where I tell them the uncertainty is so high. We talked about the complexity of the Middle East and the potential that there could be some knock-on negative demand effects. But in the short term, given inflation that's way above the Fed's target, the Fed's not going to help you with rate cuts. And that leaves us in a position where I think we're kind of in an unstable equilibrium. We're not going to have a recession, but we're not going to have a disinflationary boom as I thought we would several months ago, for reasons that have changed outside certainly my control. So we're kind of stuck in this unstable equilibrium, and I'm hoping over time, as things settle down and there's some permanence to peace in some way, that market forces reassert themselves and inflation will continue to lift, will move lower. And the Fed can ease rates and we'll get that disinflationary boom perhaps in 27. So I think right now it's interrupted, but we just have to see what happens geopolitically and also see what happens in the midterms. Because if the midterms suggest that the administration policies aren't working, then that becomes the pivot potentially as people look forward to 28 of policies. Okay, well, we tried one approach and then the pendulum's going to swing back in another direction, and people may get worried about an unwinding of the tax cuts, an unwinding of other things that people have done. So this is what I'm saying. It's a very, very dicey environment.
Right, we're on a merry-go-round. It's kind of hard to get off right now.
We're on a merry-go-round. It's hard, and this isn't always the case, but we're in a very interesting and precarious moment, and it's very difficult, and clients across the board, whether it's their investors, whether it's corporates, they're uncertain on the outlook. They're worried about U.S. politics. They're worried about the economy. They're worried about inflation. And I think it's one of the reasons why you're seeing very choppy markets, but in relatively tight bands, because it's very hard to discount the future when there's a lot of potentially zero-sum outcomes. It's very binary.
So my big thought, though, is still this on the American economy, which is we can list a lot of problems, a lot of risks. It still seems to be more stable than any other economy we're looking at. Right?
Absolutely.
Our AI companies are still coming. Technology still tends to be discovered and produced and grown in America. Ingenuity is here. Entrepreneurship is here. I think that we could kill that over some period of time, but I think it would be harder to stop that kind of American streak than we think. Okay, let's close with this. Give me a question that if you were running a company or a unit or a team, so if you're in business and you're running a business team, that you should be asking yourself about the economy right now.
Okay, I'm going to throw this back at you. Don't get mad at me, but you're obviously your business is highly technological. You invest in technology, information processing. What's AI going to do to your business?
So I think that AI has the ability for us to change from heuristics to actual data. And I'm going to use, if you remember the old book Moneyball, there's a movie with Brad Pitt, that what people realized in the baseball world was a lot of the so-called common wisdom in baseball was nothing more than like folklore that got passed down and passed down. When someone actually looked at the stats, they realized actually winning games is different than the folklore. Right. And that often in the folklore, you might even look at a player and say, well, that player looks like he'd be a good baseball player. We should just put him on the team. And sometimes a good baseball player is overweight. Sometimes they're short. Sometimes they're bald. Sometimes they don't look like good baseball players. Right. I think that we found for a lot of decision making in the capital markets, we rely way more on heuristics than we realize. And I think that AI has the ability to unlock and make capital markets decisions actually an advantage for a lot of our clients rather than a disadvantage, because we can now analyze so many more scenarios than we've ever been able to before. And then I think the second thing, we're going to find this. I've heard this said a couple times. It's something that I believe that AI is less about the technology and being ahead on the technology. Everyone's going to get to be competent in AI, and it won't take long. And being 2 or 3 months ahead on the newest model is not going to be the competitive advantage. AI is still a human problem, right? If it's no different than when a personal computer came in, than when the internet came in. AI may be like, hey, let's introduce to business a personal computer and the internet at the same time. But trying to change how a company works is a human problem. It's not really a technology problem. Right. So I think in lots and lots of different areas, as we look at AI and we look at the investment, for us, it's more about what's the right human capital, right, and how are we affecting people on the human side. In fact, we just announced yesterday an acquisition that Chatham did of a company called Hodis Weil, which is an investment bank, and it is focused on human relationships, especially with investors who are looking to invest in real estate funds. And we're doubling down on the human side, because I think one of the things that AI is going to end up doing is make interactions like this only more valuable, not less valuable.
You continue with your baseball example. Joe Torre, Hall of Fame manager for the Yankees, said, never forget the heartbeat of the game, knowing the players and the people and the personnel, despite all the statistics.
Exactly. Yeah.
To your
I think
point.
that's right.
Yeah.
And then last question, if you were giving advice to a new undergrad coming to the market right now, or someone in college, how do you deal with the uncertainty of what the business world is going to look like over the next decade? What advice would you give them?
Do you remember, I don't know if you remember, but I remember like around 25, like my parents got really smart all of a sudden. You don't really know that much when you're in high school and in college. You think you do, but you don't. So just be intellectually curious.
Would you like to say that again, just to the camera for my kids specifically?
Yeah. Well, I could talk to them because sometimes they'll listen to parents. Listen, maybe to strangers have more effect. Yeah, you don't really. You think you know, and you're good at solving problems, and a lot of bright men and women, young men and women. But I would just be intellectually curious, and never get so tied to your view that it defines who you are that you don't want to change your view. Change your view. This is great about markets, and the great investors could change their mind. That's very powerful. So be open-minded, try to get information from alternate sources. Listen to people, listen. Don't assume you know everything. Ask a lot of questions. And realize that what you think and believe at 25 is going to maybe change at 30, 40, 50, because part of who you are and what your belief structure is who you become as you grow. And that allows and explains why some people have different political views than others. But realize it can change, and be open to change, and don't align yourself with I'm this. Don't put yourself in a bucket, categorize, I'm this, I'm conservative, I'm liberal. No, just be an independent thinker and listen. That would be it. And I think it happens over time. It's sort of like, I always say like please and thank you. You've got to say it a lot, Matt, to your kids.
Right.
And maybe eventually they'll absorb it, but that'd be my advice. And realize too that whatever job you're picking, it doesn't have to be perfect. And just as long as you're learning and growing, that's great. And realize that you're probably gonna have multiple jobs over the course of your career. But always learn and try to build, your human capital, your knowledge.
Mm-hmm. You remember the comedian George Carlin?
Of course.
He had a great line, and that was, don't ever let your ideology become your identity. Because the moment you do,
perfectly put.
You can't evolve and you can't change.
Perfectly put. Or as my old boss used to say, repetition is good for the soul even if you have soul. So what you just said, just keep repeating it.
Yeah.
Keep repeating it. Eventually it will be absorbed.
I guarantee when we sat down and we started this interview, I never thought we'd end on a George Carlin quote. But thank you very much for the time.
It was my pleasure.
Thank you for the wisdom, and thank you for serving the country too.
Thank you, Matt. I appreciate it.
Take care.